Summer 1966. On the Spanish set of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, an elderly musician breaks down during a torture scene. What Clint Eastwood did next became one of the most whispered legends in cinema history. Here is the story. An elderly Spanish musician was clutching his accordion so tightly his knuckles had turned white, watching a torture scene unfold that was pulling him back to a place he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. What Clint Eastwood noticed in that man's eyes would create one of the most powerful moments of quiet compassion in film history. It was July 1966, and the cast and crew of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly were deep into production in the scorching hills outside Burgos, Spain. Sergio Leone had constructed an elaborate prisoner of war camp set, complete with wooden barracks, guard towers, and a central courtyard where one of the film's most brutal scenes would unfold. The sequence called for Tuco, played by Eli Wallach, to be tortured by Confederate soldiers while a small band of prisoners played music to mask the sounds of his suffering. It was a dark, complex scene that required precise choreography between the actors, the extras playing prisoners, and the small group of local musicians Leone had hired to play the camp band. Among those musicians was a man the crew knew only as Miguel. He was perhaps 70 years old, with deeply lined hands and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. Miguel had been hired because he could play accordion and looked authentic in the prisoner costume wardrobe had provided. Like most of the Spanish extras, he spoke little English and kept to himself between takes. Leone was in his element, orchestrating the scene with his typical intensity. The camera would start tight on Tuco's face as the torture began, then pull back to reveal the band playing, their music creating an eerie counterpoint to the violence. It was exactly the kind of haunting juxtaposition that made Leone's westerns so memorable. "Action!" Leone called out in Italian, and the scene began. The Confederate soldiers grabbed Tuco and began the choreographed beating. Eli Wallach, a seasoned professional, played the pain with convincing agony. The extras playing prisoners watched with the appropriate mixture of fear and helplessness. And the small band began to play, their music creating a haunting soundtrack to the brutality. But something was wrong. Miguel's hands, which had been steady during rehearsals, began to shake. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. His accordion wheezed and stumbled as his fingers lost their coordination. The other musicians glanced at him, concerned, but the cameras were rolling and they couldn't break character. Most of the crew was focused on the main action, watching Leone's precise choreography unfold. But Clint, standing quietly beside the camera as he often did when not in a scene, found his attention drawn to the old man with the accordion. Miguel's face had gone ashen. His eyes, which had seemed merely tired before, now looked glassy and distant. He was staring at the torture scene with an expression that Clint recognized from his own military service. It wasn't the look of someone watching a performance. It was the look of someone watching a memory. The accordion finally went silent altogether. Miguel's hands had stopped moving entirely, hanging limp at his sides while the instrument sat heavy on his chest. He was still staring at the beating, but he wasn't seeing Eli Wallach anymore. He was seeing something else, somewhere else, when else. Leone, focused on the camera monitors, hadn't noticed. The other musicians were trying to cover for Miguel's silence. The scene continued, but Clint could see that the old man was no longer present. Not really. He'd gone somewhere dark and far away. Without warning, Miguel stood up abruptly. The accordion fell to the ground with a discordant crash that echoed across the set. He took 2 unsteady steps backward, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Cut!" Clint called out loudly, his voice cutting through the scene like a blade. Leone spun around, furious at the interruption. "What are you doing? We were getting it perfect!" But Clint wasn't looking at Leone. He was walking straight toward Miguel, who was now visibly shaking. His eyes wide with something that went far beyond fear into pure terror. "Hey," Clint said softly, approaching the old man the way you might approach a wounded animal. "Hey, it's okay. It's just a movie. You're safe." Miguel looked at Clint but didn't seem to recognize him. His breathing was getting more ragged. He was having what the crew would later recognize as what we now call a panic attack, though in 1966, they just knew something was very wrong. Clint gently took Miguel's arm and guided him away from the set, away from the cameras and the watching crew, toward a quiet spot behind one of the fake barracks. He sat the old man down on a wooden crate and knelt beside him. "What's your name?" Clint asked in his limited Spanish. "Miguel," the man whispered, his voice shaking. "Miguel, you're in Spain. It's 1966. You're making a movie. You're safe." For several minutes, they sat in silence. Clint didn't try to rush the conversation or demand explanations. He just stayed present, occasionally speaking in gentle tones, until Miguel's breathing began to return to normal. Finally, in broken English mixed with Spanish, Miguel began to talk. He had been a prisoner, not in an American Civil War camp, but in a Spanish prison during the Civil War in the 1930s. He'd been barely 20 years old, arrested for playing songs that the fascists considered subversive. For 2 years, he'd been held in a camp not unlike the one Leone had constructed. "They made us play," Miguel said, his voice barely audible. "While they hurt people, always the music to cover the sounds. I played accordion then too, same songs, same sounds." Clint felt something cold settle in his stomach. The scene they'd been filming wasn't just reminiscent of Miguel's experience, it was almost identical. A band of prisoners playing music to mask torture, watched by guards who saw them as less than human. "Why didn't you tell someone?" Clint asked. Miguel looked at him with confusion. "Tell who? What would I say? It is just a job, I need the money." "Miguel," Clint said quietly, "you don't have to do this job, not this scene." "But Senor Leone, he will be angry. I signed the paper." "Let me worry about Leone." Clint helped Miguel to his feet and walked him to the craft services area, where he got the old man some water and made sure he was steady. Then he returned to the set where Leone was pacing impatiently and the crew was waiting for an explanation. "What was that about?" Leone demanded. "We lost the take because of one old man who can't handle his job?" "That old man is a veteran," Clint said simply. "This scene was triggering memories of something real he lived through." Leone waved dismissively. "Everyone has memories. We're making a movie." "Not like this," Clint said, his voice taking on an edge that made several crew members take notice. "We're not doing the scene this way." "What do you mean we're not doing it this way? I'm the director. I decide how we shoot." Clint looked at Leone with that steady gaze that had already become his trademark. "Then you can shoot it without me." The set went completely silent. In 1966, actors didn't threaten to walk off Sergio Leone's sets. Leone held all the power, all the leverage, but there was something in Clint's stance that suggested he wasn't bluffing. "What do you want?" Leone asked, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "We change the scene. No band, no music during the torture. We find another way to get the effect you want." "The music is essential. It creates the moral complexity, the commentary on how people can be complicit in violence. Then we find a different kind of music, something that doesn't require Miguel or anyone else to relive their worst memories while we roll cameras." Leone stared at Clint for what felt like minutes. The entire crew was holding its breath, waiting to see which man would blink first. Finally, Leone nodded curtly. "Fine, we'll figure something else out. But this costs us a day of shooting. Then it costs us a day." What followed was one of the most creative problem-solving sessions in the film's production. Leone, once he got past his initial anger, became intrigued by the challenge. How do you create the same haunting effect without the literal image of prisoners playing while someone is tortured? The solution they found was even more powerful than the original concept. Instead of the music masking the torture, they had it stop when the torture began, creating a silence that was somehow more terrible than sound. The emotional impact was devastating. Miguel remained on the payroll for the rest of the Spain shoot, but Leone made sure he was assigned to scenes that wouldn't trigger memories. He worked as a general extra, playing cards with other prisoners, sharing meals, participating in the daily life of the camp rather than its moments of brutality. But the story might have ended there, forgotten by everyone except the few crew members who witnessed it, if not for what happened 20 years later. In 1986, a small museum dedicated to Spanish Civil War history in Barcelona received an unusual donation. It was a letter written in careful Spanish, along with a photograph from the set of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, showing Miguel holding his accordion. The letter read, in part, "I want to donate this photograph to your collection so that people will know that sometimes Hollywood can show kindness to those who suffered." In 1966, I was hired to work on an American movie. I was just an old man who needed money, and they needed someone who could play accordion. But when they asked me to play music while they pretended to torture someone, I could not do it. I was back in 1938, back in the camp where they made us play while they hurt our friends. I thought I would lose the job and the money I needed for my grandchildren. Instead, the tall American actor, the one who became famous from that movie, he saw that I was in pain. He stopped the filming. He sat with me. He made them change the scene so I would not have to suffer. I never forgot that kindness. In a world where powerful people usually ignore the pain of powerless people, he used his power to protect an old man's heart. This is why I loved his movies afterwards, not because he was a good actor, but because I knew he was a good man. The letter was signed simply Miguel Herrera and dated 3 months before his death. The museum curator who received the letter tried to verify its authenticity. She contacted several people who had worked on the film, including some who were still alive. While none could confirm every detail of Miguel's account, several remembered the incident of stopping filming because of an extra's distress, and all remembered Clint's reputation for quiet consideration of the crew. Word of Miguel's letter eventually reached film historians studying the production of the good, the bad, and the ugly. It became part of the legend of the film, one of those stories that gets passed down among people who work in movies, a reminder that sometimes the cameras capture not just performances, but moments of genuine humanity. Clint was asked about the incident years later in an interview. His response was characteristically brief. Sometimes people have been through things that the rest of us can't imagine. When you recognize that kind of pain, you have a choice. You can ignore it because it's inconvenient, or you can do something about it. It wasn't a hard choice. But for those who know the legend, it represents something larger than just one kind act on one movie set. It's a reminder that behind every extra, every background player, every person who briefly crosses the frame of a movie, there's a full human life with its own joys and traumas and secrets. Miguel Herrera spent his final years telling his grandchildren about the day a movie star saw his pain and chose to act with compassion instead of convenience. His story became part of their family history, passed down as an example of unexpected kindness in a world that often provides too little of it. This is the story of how one moment of recognition, one choice to value a person's dignity over a production schedule, created ripples that lasted decades. Sometimes the most important scenes in our lives are the ones that never make it to the screen. Have you ever had someone notice your pain when everyone else looked away? Share a moment when unexpected kindness changed your day in the comments. And remember that the power to see others' humanity is something we all possess. Sometimes the most powerful scenes happen when cameras stop rolling. Miguel's letter reminds us that small acts of compassion echo through decades. When did someone's kindness surprise you? Subscribe for more legendary Clint moments.